Welcome to Life After Dogma, exploring what life looks like when we start paying attention to the ways our beliefs shape reality. Today we're going to be covering Christ consciousness, how we found it, what it is, and how it connects with what we're interested in. So let's get started.
So Christ consciousness for us, this is a really good starting point for our podcast, because when we heard this term, I feel like both of us, it kind of like really clicked, and it kind of sent us off on this like new exploration that we're doing now. You and I both were raised in a Christian background. You know, we were part of a church. We went every Sunday, went to Sunday school, all of that. But then as we got older, or even during the time, I don't think either one of us, it really like resonated with us, or just something about it. We just weren't really hooked into this whole dogma, this like system of a belief system and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we left home and no longer had to go to church in order to go out to eat on Sundays, we kind of left it, and I just ignored it. I just wasn't interested in it anymore.
There was no pull or draw or reason to go to church every week.
Yeah, exactly. So we just kind of ignored it. You know, it was just like not a part. And then as we got older, or I feel like actually probably more like when we had kids, the morning of the religion, because when the kids were born, we thought, well, should we go to church? Like, are you supposed to have that? Because society tells us that we should be part of a community, because now we've got kids. And so we kind of tried it, and we were like, this is stupid. Like, this doesn't fit for us. And
didn't feel right.
And then it really hit me like, oh, I really don't have any religion. I don't have a belief system, and kind of like all of my belief systems crumbled, and that one went too. And I feel like I went through the mourning process where I was angry at it, and then I was like sad and like missed parts of it, but I didn't even understand why. And now I realize that it was like a mourning of releasing this control system that was like so ingrained in my mind, like finally dealing with it and not ignoring it and just saying goodbye to it. And then we didn't really have anything, or we were like still kind of wandering and trying to figure things out. And I don't remember how you found Christ consciousness, but I really remember like it was a day in the kitchen, and you were like mentioned this word, this like term, and I had never heard of it before. And this was like recent, like in the last couple of years. And I remember Googling it and searching for it, and there was like nothing about Christ consciousness. Now, if you Google it, you find all kinds of stuff. There's like a lot more information about it, and there's there's the Christian view of Christ consciousness, there's the secular view, or the or the like New Age view, and those types of things. But I didn't really. To me, Christ consciousness was looking at. Without Google searching and everything, in my mind, when you said that, it opened up the possibility of Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha and all of these religious leaders, instead of being this dogmatic control system, that they, at the root of it, they were all just ascended beings, like beings who had tapped into something bigger and wanted to share it with humanity. Right. And so when I started looking at it like that, it's like, oh, all of these teachings that all of them are saying have a lot of threads that are very similar. And they also, it just got me really excited, because it's like, I don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I can look at these different religious teachings and pick out of it what they were trying to say, or what I believe they were trying to say is that, we are all the same as they are. And they were just trying to show us a way of connecting to something greater than ourselves. But we have the authority. It's like a personal authority is what Christ consciousness was for me.
Yeah. So I have been trying to remember back when I first came across the term. It was within the last 5 years. I saw somebody that I follow mention it online, and it was foreign to me as well. But I've done a little bit of research, and I think a lot of the ideas behind it are more familiar to us than I had initially thought. So maybe we'll start there. So long before Jesus, there were civilizations and traditions across the world that spoke of this divine spark awakening in human form. And that essentially is what Jesus represented. So you find this in India with, Krishna embodying divine love in human form. The Atman and Brahman expresses the same unity. And I think in some groups, they even called that the Christ within later. In Egypt, the Osiris myth of death and rebirth and resurrection, all as stages of spiritual awakening. There's also this concept in Zoroastrianism that introduced this duality of light and darkness. But the important thing there is the soul's task is to remember and reunite with the light, which is core in Gnosticism, which we'll get into in a second. But the bottom line is there's many different traditions. There's, also in China, even in like Mesoamerica of, have you heard of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent?
Yes.
Okay, so
But I don't remember much of it.
Okay, so I've found that the symbolism there is that it's divine wisdom descending into form to awaken humanity. So there's this thread of, that spark, the divine spark awakening in human form, and the idea is that it awakens in all of us, which is getting to the point of what Christ consciousness is. So this Christ pattern, or this illumination, which is what to be Christed is, it's divine consciousness awakening within us. It existed long before Christianity, long before Jesus, and every culture, or many cultures, encoded the same archetype. So we have this forgetting, this awakening, and this reunion with Source.
Yeah. And that is what's so crazy, is that it's so apparent in so many different cultures and religions. And yet, because we were so ingrained when we were younger in one singular one, and, I am the way type of thing, or just like the literal meaning of it, that it's like before hearing Christ consciousness, it's like that's all. I had no idea that there were so many others that were sharing a very similar concept and idea as Christianity. Or, there was a little bit, because you have the more major religions,
right.
and, a little bit of it, but we weren't allowed to talk about any of those because those were all they were not the correct answer. So I honestly am incredibly ignorant to all of those. And it was by design to keep me ignorant.
It was. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. So getting into, how the church as a organization was formed and why it took the path we did. Let's get to that. But just before, I think it's important to set the context for the time and place in which Jesus was born, because you'll see like how Christianity itself kind of grew. Even though it kind of shared this similar idea, this Christ pattern with other ones, it was also, it had its own unique situation in which it came to be. So that whole Mediterranean world at the time of Jesus was this dense spiritual network of many different thoughts, this crossroads of different civilizations. So there was the Greek philosophical influence. Jewish mysticism had been practiced in that area for, thousands of years at that point. The Egyptian empire wasn't that far away. The Persian one, which is where Zoroastrianism came from. And there were also these mystery cults from Greek traditions, Egyptians, and others just in that region at the time. So it was a time, like at the time that Jesus was living, and in the couple hundred years afterwards, it was a time of spiritual experimentation. So there was a lot of seekers blending traditions, sharing different symbols, comparing truths. And the idea that the divine lives within us wasn't new, even at that time, at least in the mystical circles. But I think part of the reason why the Jesus story took off is that he embodied it directly and in human form, which made it more accessible. So his message fit that pattern perfectly of, the kingdom of heaven is within us. And, the other ideas of, love your neighbor as yourself, all those were very accessible and relatable because he was a human in human form, or God in human form. It's probably the better way to say it.
So I'm like just like going through all of this and thinking of the stories that I grew up with, and to hear, and also she kind of gets into this in A History of God. Karen Armstrong talks about it too, kind of what you're talking about how there were so many different stories and different connections to a higher being, or religions and stuff, whereas from a modern Christian perspective of what I was raised in, like I just thought there was like Judaism, and that was, and there was Judaism, and then Christianity came out of that, and that was kind of it. Like, just to hear that, just like that there was so many different traditions at that time right there, and all of them, like, they were living in communities all together, like societies, like
in that area,
sharing those things and feeding off of each other is like so embarrassingly new to me, or it was whenever we started to look into this.
And then there's the time that happened, after Jesus lived, and Christianity became, or started to become like a teaching, or not even a doctrine at that point, but just the teachings of Jesus started to be disseminated throughout the region. It was popular, but Christianity, wasn't one faith at that time, but it was many independent circles. Similar to before he came, there was all these different traditions. Even those that were teaching the message of Jesus, there was lots of independent circles experimenting with how to live what Jesus taught. Some groups were more focused on ethics and community. Others were more focused on the mystical revelation and the ability to have a direct experience of God. The Gnostics, who we mentioned a little while ago, saw Christ not as a savior to worship, but as a mirror of their own divine potential. So back to that awakening of the spark within. And for roughly 300 years, these movements coexisted in, this lively spiritual ecosystem transfer of ideas. But it was only as the Roman Empire began to lose political control around 300 years after Jesus, it absorbed what was becoming the, formalized Christian church as its new organizing structure. So the Roman Empire never truly died. It just transformed into the Catholic Church, carrying forward the empirical hierarchy under religious authority. So this empire and theology created this control system. So in plain terms, I think of it as like the faith became about, like, you showed your faith through obedience.
Rather than like an exploration and a what am I, who am I?
Exactly. And then, as that took control, that diversity of all these different independent circles slowly became erased, or, because they were no longer the dominant power. There became a dominant power structure, and there was less room for them. So surely they continued to exist, but they had to keep quiet about it.
And I could see like the appeal of this control system, like at a time when an empire is crumbling and people are like, what's next? And there's like uncertainty and everything, to have some entity say, I know this is the definitive truth, and you no longer have to kind of, search in the dark on your own or like figure things out for yourself. Like I have the answer for you, and you're like, oh, what a relief. Like there's some certainty for me. And I could just see it being really appealing at a time when there was so much uncertainty. But then you just kind of get stuck in there and you're just give away your power, and then you're in the control system and you don't really know how to get out.
Right. And there was no separation of church and state because of, how that it came to be. But as Rome consolidated power through the church, the movements that continued to exist that followed the teachings or preached the teachings of Jesus, the movements that moved forward were quieter, but they kept some of these teachings of, this inner spark alive. One of those groups was the Gnostics, and they were educated in both the Greek Platonic philosophy as well as the Hermetic tradition that came from Egypt. And, as we mentioned, they understood that Jesus's message was this one of a direct personal communication with, all that is, because we're really just communicating with different aspects of consciousness, which we are all a part of. It wasn't this submission to external authority. So they saw the church, the Roman church, rising hierarchy as just another form of a control system designed to, obscure truth and feed on fear.
So then what happened? Like, why am I just now hearing about the Gnostics? Like, why have I not heard of them before?
Yeah, so the big reason was that their texts of their group were buried in jars in deserts near
like literally buried in jars in deserts.
Yeah, I mean they were intentionally under the radar. So because they became more persecuted, as time passed, so many of their texts were hidden, and their history was hidden. And it was only in 1945, in a place called Nag Hammadi, that they were rediscovered. So what those writings revealed is, this alternate vision of Christianity rooted in self-realization, unity, personal sovereignty, which was very much at odds with the Roman Catholic Church's control model.
And what a cool age that we are in now, to where these things that were hopefully, like probably many hoped, would never resurface again, that we are in this information age where you and I have access to and the ability to find these types of teachings. And, of course, I don't want to replace one dogma for another or anything, but I think it's just really eye-opening to see that there have been these thoughts and ideas for a long time. And I think it's just right now is where humanity, the masses of us, have like more access to these things that were hidden from us before, to where we can start questioning and we can truly find the inner authority, because now we're like our eyes are opening. We're having a spiritual awakening, right? We're seeing that, like what we were fed all of our lives is just a fraction, like not a fraction of a fraction of the complexity and the depth of what is available to us in this human experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the age of a new knowledge. Some call it the age of Aquarius. But it does seem to be like this information available to us, certainly through the internet, that wasn't easily accessible, before even just recent years. I mean, you mentioned that you Googled the term a couple of years ago, Christ consciousness, and not much came back. But it wasn't just the Gnostics that, preserved some of these teachings. As the Roman Church absorbed Christianity, there were other mystical teaching groups out there, and a lot of those were preserved by, if you've heard of mystery schools, secret circles, which some say became secret societies. There was this whole group of scientists that explored the convergence of spirituality and science through alchemy. Also in that region at the time, you've heard of the Library of Alexandria. That had already been a spiritual crossroads where Egyptian, Greek, early Christian mysticism, it all kind of blended freely. That's interesting to me because I'm drawn to the Hermetic principles, and I think we see through some of those, which, if you're not familiar, there are these metaphysical laws describing the structure of consciousness itself. And a lot of that ideology corresponds with what we're talking about with Christ consciousness. For example, there's the principle of mentalism: all is mind, the mind is all. Another way to think about that is the Christ mind as the creative source of reality, or the as above, so below, as within, so without, the inner kingdom mirrored in the outer world. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Those are just a couple of them, but it's just more evidence to me of the interconnectedness between things.
Yeah, and one thing that stood out to me when you were talking about it, about how you were saying there's all these different groups that have kind of carried this. You use the word secret, like secret society or all of these types of things. And in my mind, that like the rebel that I am, I guess, is like a red flag of like, oh, great, here's another gatekeeper. But just before we were talking, we were starting to record this, I like flipped open to a page in The History of God by Karen Armstrong, and she had a really good point about this secret society. And I'm just going to read it real quick. She said, "We have seen that mysticism was often seen as an esoteric discipline, not because the mystics wanted to exclude the vulgar herd," which is what I was thinking whenever you said that, but because these truths could only be perceived by the intuitive part of the mind after special training. They mean something different when they are approached by this particular route, which is not accessible to the logical rationalist faculty.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not that it's like we don't have access to it, but it's more like we just have to unlearn all of this stuff that's getting in the way of like truly being able to connect with the teachings that they're trying to show. And if you're an untrained mind, or if you're like not open to seeing things in a different perspective, then it's gonna ring in a totally different way.
Yeah. And I think even though a lot of these, alternative ideas were kept secret for a long time, and a lot of that was due to the, political environment of, when the church became the doctrine and the empire. But at the same time, these ideas keep resurfacing. I think in every generation, there's this same truth that gets, whispered, maybe not to everybody, but to many, that, divinity is within, and consciousness is the bridge back to all that is. And in fact, some of these ideas resurfaced during the Renaissance. That's when the Hermetic principles were rediscovered. These influenced philosophers, mystics, and many of the modern esoteric traditions, including, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, and later Theosophy, which is one of the ways that this Christ consciousness idea made it back to, or made it to us, in the 20th and 21st century.
So what is Theosophy?
Okay, so Theosophy, that was Helena Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner, late 1800s. They were Europeans that became very interested in combining these Christian mystical ideas with Eastern, like Hindu and Buddhist ideas. They went, I know Helena Blavatsky went to Tibet to study a lot of their teachings, and they were trying to find this esoteric thread between all of these things. And that really was that, Christ came as this cosmic being, as many have, which have helped guide human evolution. Rudolf Steiner described the Christ, he called it the Christ impulse, as the heart center of awakening of humanity and the balancing of spirit and matter. So those were how they popularized this esoteric mysticism that pulled from many different traditions. That made its way over to the United States and the West in the late 1800s, early 20th century.
And then here we are.
Well, some things have happened since then. There was the spiritual renaissance of like the 60s and 70s in the US. A lot of Eastern teachers like Maharishi and Yogananda literally came to the United States and brought many of their Eastern ideas, and that converged with some of those Western mystical ideas. There's also the psychedelic exploration of that time, and the channeling movements became more popular starting in the 60s. A lot of books were written. We've read several of them in the 70s and 80s of, channeled works where people were communicating directly, or other beings were communicating directly through humans. So Christ consciousness has reemerged, at the end of the 20th century, coming into this century, not as a religion, but more as this frequency of unity and love and overall creative awareness.
Yeah, and for us specifically, just like an insatiable desire to just explore and to just see what's out there in like the best way possible. Like it has really opened up our ability to explore so many of these amazing ideas and concepts that have emerged for centuries.
All these things have come together at this time for this modern reawakening. That's how it feels to me. That's how it looks to me as I look back and kind of learn more about how many of these different thoughts have converged, and some of them within our lifetime. So there's this return of this direct knowing. We already talked about, the digitization of all these things and translation into a language that we can read. It's reunited many of the world's spiritual archives, and we can start to connect the dots between them. So our collective library is open again. I mean, the idea of the internet being the Alexandria of our time, where all this is available to us.
And even more now, like you and I can even add.
Exactly. Yeah, we can access it and bring our thoughts to it. Also, I think we're seeing more with science meeting kind of this spiritual side, or at least a higher dimension, or a broader world around us. A lot of that was explored in the 20th century with quantum physics, the neuroscience of consciousness in recent years. A lot of people that look into energy healing and homeopathic remedies for things that have long been used in mystical traditions. They were also identifying that the scientific language that we're using today literally gives modern people like us that permission slip to explore what was just considered mystical and taboo. But the more that it's kind of put into the terms of our times, and I think it's becoming more accepted by the mainstream, and even many within scientific circles are exploring more of consciousness and what is it, and what is this spark that seems to run through all of us.
Yeah, and I hear the term a lot more now, this idea of both and I think it's kind of that too. Like we don't have to just like have like a laser focus on like this is the
It's
only
all
thing.
these things.
It's like both and then that just opens it up from a scientific, from a spiritual perspective of like getting curious again about all of this, which we kind of lost, which was so strange. Now when I look back, I'm like, that's so wild that we wanted everything to be so black and white when the color and the complexity is like so fun to explore. And I think that's kind of what this whole discovery of Christ consciousness has been for us. It was the permission slip. It was the whatever to like to get curious again and to just start looking around. And in our daily lives, that's kind of what it is. Like everything that when we're just talking, it's like the fun little things pop up that maybe I would have looked at in a very different perspective when I was under the thumb of the dogmatic.
Right. It's much more
Principles.
exciting
Yeah.
through this lens.
Yeah. And then you can say, oh, right, it was this that we learned when we were younger, and this, or that maybe was influenced by this, and look at how they're connected. And just like seeing the connectedness of this like web of knowledge is so much more satisfying.
I agree. And I think that a big part of the draw to Christ consciousness to me is it's this idea of, remembering who we really are and what our potential is.
That's great. Well, I think that's like probably a good ending on this topic, and we can pick up one of the threads that we mentioned for the next one.
Sounds good.